With less than 4 hours remaining before his scheduled execution, the final request from the man they called Old Blood wasn't for a phone call to family, wasn't for a chaplain's prayer, and wasn't even for a last meal. It was to stand in the yard with the prison's most dangerous patrol dog. The cell block went silent when he asked. At 74 years old, Moses Washington was the oldest man on the row, his hair a shock of white against his dark skin, and his hands trembling with the weight of 30 years of stolen time until he asked for Rex. The air in the Louisiana Supermax was thick with the scent of floor wax and ozone, but the tension spiked when the warden realized Moses wasn't asking for a pet, but for a witness. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 20,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. The shadows in cell 402 didn't just fall across the floor, they seemed to seep out of the very marrow of Moses Washington's bones. He sat on the edge of a metal cot that had been his only world for 3 decades, his weathered face a map of every appeal denied, and every sunset he had only ever seen through a 4-inch slit of reinforced glass. His hands, once strong enough to guide the most headstrong beasts, now looked like parched earth, gnarled and fragile. Every breath he drew in that sterile silence felt like a betrayal of the life he was supposed to have lived. He thought of the family he had kept at a distance, a self-imposed exile born of a desperate, silent need to protect them from the shadow of his own cross. Outside his bars, the heavy, rhythmic thud of the guards' boots sounded like a funeral drum, a constant reminder of the ticking clock that governed his final hours. They saw a federal assassin, a ghost of a crime he never committed. But Moses saw the truth in the way he held his posture straight, disciplined, and unbroken by the weight of the lies meant to bury him. The silence of the prison wing was a heavy, suffocating thing, yet in his mind he could still hear the soft panting of a loyal partner and the click of a leash that had once been his life's work. He didn't want a final meal because there was no hunger left in a man who had been hollowed out by injustice. He only wanted one moment of recognition, one final look into the eyes of a creature that couldn't be bribed, broken, or lied to. As the orange jumpsuit hung loosely on his frail frame, Moses closed his eyes, preparing to step out of the long shadow and into the light of a truth only a predator could see. The heavy silence of the cell block was often broken by the ghost of a younger man's memories, a time before the concrete had swallowed his life whole. In 1994, Moses Washington didn't walk with a limp or carry the weight of 30 years of stolen time. He moved with the fluid, quiet confidence of a man who spoke a language without words. He closed his eyes, and suddenly, the sterile scent of the penitentiary was replaced by the damp, earthy smell of the training fields at dawn. He could still feel the phantom pull of a leather lead against his palm and the warm, steady heartbeat of a Belgian Malinois pressed against his knee. Back then, he was the architect of shadows, training elite K9 units to be more than just dogs. They were extensions of his own soul, disciplined, fiercely loyal, and capable of detecting a lie before it was ever spoken. He remembered the pride he felt watching those animals work, their intelligence a reflection of his own patience and care. He had treated them with a tenderness the world rarely showed a black man in a position of such unique power. But that power was a double-edged sword. The very government that had lauded his exceptional mastery of canine instinct eventually turned that mastery into his cage. They took his techniques, his blood, and his sweat, and when they needed a ghost to blame for a high-level failure, they chose the man who knew too much and said too little. It was the ultimate betrayal, a knife to the heart of a man who believed in the bond of service. As Moses sat in the dim light of his final morning, the irony tasted like ash in his mouth. The elite units he had pioneered, the dogs trained to be the ultimate guardians, were now the ones patrolling the fences that kept him from his family. He had lived his life by a code of silence, a quiet strength intended to shield those he loved from the fallout of his world. But that silence had only built his gallows. Now, with the clock bleeding out, the only way to break the conspiracy was to reach back through the decades and call upon the only thing that had never lied to him, the primal, incorruptible instinct of a dog. He wasn't just a prisoner waiting for the end. He was a master handler preparing for one last, desperate lesson in the truth. Warden Miller sat in his high-backed leather chair, the heavy silence of his office punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock that seemed to be counting down Moses Washington's final hours with a cruel, mechanical indifference. Before him lay the thin, weathered file of a man who had become a fixture of the row, a quiet, dignified presence, who had never once caused a stir in 30 years. The warden's eyes traced the lines of Moses's unusual final request, a 10-minute assessment of Rex, the facility's most vicious K9. It was an absurd demand, a move that defied every standard operating procedure in the book, yet something in the request pulled at a thread of curiosity Miller couldn't quite shake. He flipped to the back of the folder, past the decades of denied appeals and sterile legal jargon, until he found the yellowed remnants of Moses's pre-conviction life. There, buried in a section nearly lost to time, was a single, startling sentence that had been overlooked for a generation. Handler displays exceptional mastery of canine instinct. The warden leaned back, the leather groaning under his weight, as he wrestled with the absurdity of it. Rex wasn't a pet. He was a 90-pound weapon of teeth and muscle that had already sent 3 veteran guards to the infirmary this year. To allow a 74-year-old man, frail and shackled, into a confined space with such a beast felt like signing a second death warrant before the first could even be carried out. And yet, as Miller looked at the grainy intake photo of a younger, sharper Moses, he saw a man who had once been a master of his craft, a man whose legacy was built on a bond deeper than fear. The weight of the impending execution pressed down on the room, a somber fog that made the warden's chest tighten. He knew the world outside was clamoring for justice, but in the stillness of his office, looking at the man's spotless disciplinary record, he felt the cold, creeping doubt that often haunted those who walked the path to the gallows. If Moses wanted 10 minutes of his old life back, a final taste of the purpose that had been stolen from him in 1994, who was Miller to deny it? With a heavy sigh and a hand that shook slightly as he signed the authorization form, the warden made his choice. He picked up the intercom, his voice rasping with the gravity of the decision. Prepare the yard. 10 minutes. Heavy sniper overwatch. Bring him Rex. Miller watched through the reinforced glass as the guards began to scramble, a part of him wondering if he was granting a dying man's wish or facilitating his murder. He thought of his own father, a man of quiet secrets and calloused hands, and for a fleeting second, he saw the same impenetrable dignity in Moses's eyes. He had granted the request, but as he watched the sun dip lower towards the horizon, he realized he wasn't just giving Moses a dog, he was opening a door to a past that was never meant to be revisited. The authorization sat on his desk, a small white slip of paper that felt as heavy as a tombstone. Moses had asked for a witness, and the warden had just provided the most dangerous one in the state. He had given the old man exactly what he wanted, but as the clock ticked closer to the end, Miller couldn't help but feel that the truth Moses was looking for was a fire that might burn them all to the ground. Sometimes, the hardest thing to give a man is the very thing that will finally set him free. Moses had his 10 minutes, but as the first shadows of the evening stretched across the yard, the silence that followed felt less like peace and more like the breath held just before a scream. The heavy iron door of the death row wing groaned on its hinges, a sound that usually signaled the beginning of the end. Moses Washington stepped across the threshold, his legs thin and brittle as dry kindling, each step a testament to the 30 years the state had stolen from him. The shackles around his ankles rattled with a rhythmic, lonely clink against the cold concrete, a sound that echoed through the high-security yard of the Louisiana Penitentiary. He moved with a slow, agonizing dignity, his white hair catching the harsh glare of the midday sun. Around him, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the oppressive weight of the supermax silence, broken only by the heavy breathing of the guards and the distant, frantic barking of the K9 unit. Up in the towers, the sunlight glinted off the scopes of sniper rifles, a dozen cold eyes watching the frail, 74-year-old man as if he were the most dangerous threat in the world. Then he saw Rex. The 90-pound German Shepherd was a blur of black and tan fury at the end of a thick steel cable, his muscles bunching and rippling as he lunged with a ferocity that had already sent half the guard staff to the infirmary. Rex's snarls were primal, a guttural vibration that Moses felt deep in his own chest, yet the old man didn't flinch. As he drew closer, the smell of the dog, the raw, wild scent of fur and wet earth, hit him like a memory he had been dying to touch for 3 decades. To the guards, Rex was a beast that needed to be broken. To Moses, he was a soul that had been weaponized by the same system that had turned a master handler into a ghost. The distance between them closed, and the tension in the yard became a physical thing. A wire pulled so tight, it was ready to snap. Moses looked at the dog, his eyes clouded with age but sharp with a recognition that transcended time. He saw the fire in Rex's eyes and remembered the dawn training sessions of 1994, the warmth of a loyal partner's head against his palm, and the silent promises made before the world went dark. The guards braced themselves, their hands hovering over their holsters, expecting the elderly inmate to be torn apart by the very predator he had requested. Moses took one more trembling step, the chains at his wrists biting into his skin, and for a fleeting second, the entire world held its breath. He was a man standing on the edge of a grave he had spent 30 years digging, facing a creature that knew only the language of violence. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of Moses to the dog, and the snarl faltered for a heartbeat. In that silence, the gap between the prisoner and the predator grew wider than the yard itself, leaving only a hollow space where a lifetime of stolen moments should have been. He was so close now that he could see the graying fur around Rex's muzzle, a mirror of his own aged face. He had reached the end of the line, and the only thing left was the cold, biting realization of how much had been lost in the silence. The master handler was back, but the leash was no longer in his hands. The 90-pound German shepherd, Rex, was a jagged silhouette of fury, lunging against his steel cable with a guttural roar that seemed to vibrate through the very concrete of the Louisiana yard. The guards held their breath, their fingers twitching over holsters as they watched the frail, 4-year-old Moses Washington stand just feet away from the beast's bared teeth. To the onlookers, this was a suicide mission, the final act of a broken man seeking a violent end before the state could claim him. But Moses stood perfectly still, his white hair gleaming in the harsh sun, his dark, weathered eyes locked onto the animal's gaze with a piercing clarity that hadn't been seen in 30 years. The noise of the prison, the shouting guards, the rattling chains, the distant sirens seemed to fall away into a vacuum of absolute silence. Moses drew a slow, deliberate breath, his chest expanding under his loose orange jumpsuit, and then he spoke. It wasn't a shout or a plea. It was a single, low-frequency word, uttered in a dead language, the secret tongue of the elite handlers he had once led in 1994. The sound was small, but its impact was tectonic. Rex, mid-lunge, froze as if struck by lightning. The terrifying roar died in his throat, replaced by a confused, high-pitched whimper that broke the hearts of those watching. The dog's tail dropped, his hackles smoothed, and his entire body softened, sinking into a submissive crouch as he recognized the master he had been waiting for his entire life. Moses slowly reached out a trembling, gnarled hand, and the monster that had bitten half the guard staff gently pressed its wet nose into his palm. The yard went so quiet that the sound of the old man's sob was like a thunderclap. For a moment, they weren't in a high-security penitentiary. They were back in the dew-covered fields of the past, two souls finally reunited after a lifetime of stolen years. Moses leaned down, his forehead resting against the dog's velvet ears, whispering a name only the two of them knew. The guards watched in stunned, tearful silence as the most dangerous creature in the state became a shield for the man it was supposed to destroy. But as the wind shifted, carrying the scent of a new arrival, Rex's ears snapped sideways, his body going rigid once more. Moses felt the shift in the dog's muscles, a different kind of alert, cold and deadly. The reunion they had waited 30 years for was being cut short by a shadow moving near the warden, a shadow that didn't belong. The master had found his dog, but the master also knew that in this place of lies, a peaceful ending was the one thing the world would never allow them to keep. The hand that had just found comfort in soft fur now clenched into a fist, realizing the true predator was no longer at the end of a leash. The heavy, humid air of the yard seemed to solidify as the assistant warden stepped forward, his polished boots crunching on the gravel with a cold, predatory rhythm. The 10 minutes were nearly up, and the brief, miraculous peace between the old man and the beast was an affront to the sterile cruelty of the institution. Moses felt the shift in Rex's body before he saw it. The dog's muscles, once soft under his hand, turned into coiled steel. The low, vibrating growl that started in the German shepherd's chest wasn't for Moses. It was a warning directed at the man approaching them. Moses looked up, his tired eyes meeting the assistant warden's gaze, and for a fleeting second, he saw not a public servant, but the face of the corruption that had swallowed his life whole. As the official reached into his pocket, Rex's hackles spiked like a crown of thorns. The dog's nose twitched, his superior senses catching the sharp, chemical tang of a specialized neurotoxin. Clinging to the man's surgical gloves, a scent Moses had taught his K9S to identify as death long before the world turned its back on him. This wasn't just an aggressive dog, it was an alert. The assistant warden froze, his hand trembling as he realized the 4-year-old inmate and the animal were no longer just a prisoner and a predator, but a team once more. The truth was in the air, thick and suffocating, as Rex's snarl intensified into a terrifying promise of justice. Moses held the dog's gaze, a single tear carving a path through the dust on his cheek. He had spent 30 years protecting a world that had forgotten him, keeping silent to shield a family that thought him a monster. Now, as the shadow of the needle loomed, his only witness was a creature the system had trained to kill. The gap between them, the decades of loneliness, the stolen birthdays, the empty chairs at Sunday dinner yawned wide and hollow. He had found his partner, but the price of the truth was a confrontation that would either set him free or bury them both in the dirt of the prison yard. The assistant warden took one more step, and the world tilted. Moses whispered a final, silent goodbye to the peace he had just found, knowing that to save his life, he was about to lose the quiet dignity of his old age. The dog lunged, not out of hate, but out of a loyalty that time couldn't touch, and in that moment, the silence of the yard was shattered forever. Moses had his witness, but the cost of the testimony was a heart that had already been broken too many times to count. The leash was gone, and there was no way to call him back. The yard erupted in a symphony of chaos as Rex launched his massive frame forward, not toward the frail old man, but at the assistant warden. In a blur of fur and bared teeth, the German shepherd neutralized the corrupt official, pinning him to the sun-baked concrete before a single guard could pull a trigger. The air was filled with the assistant warden's sharp cries of terror and the frantic shouting of officers. But Moses Washington remained the eye of the storm. He stood perfectly still, his white hair a beacon of calm amidst the violence, as he watched the truth finally claw its way out of the shadows. The snipers in the towers held their fire, paralyzed by the sight of the prison's most vicious predator, acting not as a killer, but as a sentinel. With the steady, resonant voice of the master handler he had once been, Moses began to speak, his words cutting through the bedlam like a knife through silk. He calmly explained the alert, detailing the specific chemical scent Rex had detected, the specialized poison meant to end his life, before he could ever reach the chair. He spoke of the betrayal in 1994, of the lives he had saved, and of the one he had lost to a system that preferred a convenient lie to a difficult truth. As he spoke, the aggressive barking of the other K9S in the distance seemed to soften, as if even they recognized the weight of his testimony. The guards, who had spent years looking at Moses as nothing more than a number on a cell door, now looked at him with a dawning, horrific realization of the injustice they had facilitated. Tears tracked through the deep lines of Moses's face as he looked at Rex, who remained vigilant over the captured official. The dog's loyalty was the only pure thing left in a world that had stripped Moses of his name, his youth, and his family. He had spent 30 years in a tomb of silence to protect those he loved, but in this final hour, it was a beast's instinct that had finally given him a voice. The gap between the man who was meant to die and the man who deserved to live was closing, but it was paved with the rubble of 3 decades of stolen moments. He had proven his innocence, but he could never get back the 30 years of Sunday dinners, the birthdays he missed, or the sound of his children's laughter that had long since faded into a hollow echo. The warden stepped into the yard, his face pale as he surveyed the scene, The realization of a near-fatal mistake etched into his features. The execution was halted, the silence that followed more deafening than the previous roar of the crowd. Moses reached down one last time to touch Rex's head, his fingers trembling with a mixture of grief and relief. He had won his life back, but as he looked around the sterile, high-security walls, he realized that the man who had entered this prison 30 years ago was gone forever, leaving behind only a ghost who had finally found his way home. The truth had set him free, but it couldn't mend a heart that had been broken for half a lifetime. Justice had finally arrived, but she was 30 years too late to save the man Moses used to be. The sudden halt of the execution clock didn't bring the sound of celebration. It brought the frantic, scratching sound of pens on paper and the low, urgent hum of a dozen phone lines being opened at once. Inside the prison's administration wing, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the cold, metallic tang of fear as the poison, found on the assistant warden's gloves, was whisked away for a black site audit. Moses Washington sat in a small, windowless interrogation room, his frail hands still bearing the faint scent of Rex's fur. He looked at the federal investigators through eyes that had seen 30 years of shadows, his expression not one of triumph, but of a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Every document they pulled from the vaulted archives of 1994 felt like a bandage being ripped off, a wound that had never been allowed to heal. The paperwork began to bleed the truth. As the investigators audited the original logs, they found the gaps Moses had always known were there, the signatures that didn't match, the forensic reports that had been misplaced just days before his trial, and the digital footprints of a cleanup operation designed to hide the real assassin's identity behind the face of a legendary handler. The poison found in the yard was the final, undeniable proof. It was a proprietary compound used only by the same shadowy agency that had once employed Moses to train their elite units. They hadn't just framed him to close a case, they had buried him alive to ensure his silence remained absolute. Now, that silence was being shattered by the very beast they had trained to be a weapon. Across the hall, the assistant warden broke under the weight of the evidence. His confession, a stuttering, pathetic admission of a decades-old conspiracy. But for Moses, the legal victory felt like a hollow echo in a room that had been empty for far too long. He thought of his children, now grown with lives he had only ever read about in censored letters, and his wife, who had passed away while he was counting the cracks in his cell wall. He had won his life back, but the cost was the life he was actually supposed to live. The investigation was moving with a speed that felt like an insult to the 30 years he had spent waiting for a single person to listen. As the first light of a new dawn began to creep under the door, the warden entered the room, his eyes red-rimmed and his voice barely a whisper. He didn't offer a handshake. He simply handed Moses a release order that was still wet with ink. The execution gurney was being dismantled in the next room, its straps unbuckled for the first time in years. Moses stood up, his joints popping like dry twigs, and realized that for the first time in 3 decades, no one was going to tell him when to sit down. He had survived the long night, and the truth had finally been spoken. But as he looked at the stack of paperwork that proved his innocence, he realized it was just a pile of dead trees trying to replace a lifetime of stolen heartbeats. He was free to go, but there was no one left to tell him, "Welcome home." The paper trail had finally ended, leaving him standing at the edge of a world he no longer recognized, clutching a freedom that felt as heavy as his chains. The sun didn't just rise on the day of Moses Washington's release. It seemed to shatter over the horizon, spilling a gold so bright it felt like a physical weight against his skin. For 30 years, he had lived in a world of artificial hums and the gray, suffocating geometry of a concrete box. But as the final heavy gate of the Louisiana Supermax groaned open, the air that hit him was wild and sweet, smelling of rain-slicked earth, and the freedom he had long ago stopped believing was real. He stepped forward, his legs thin and trembling beneath the cheap, ill-fitting suit the state provided, his white hair catching the morning light like a halo of survival. He was 74 years old, and for the first time in half a lifetime, the rattle of steel against steel didn't follow his every move. Waiting just beyond the perimeter fence was a black SUV, but Moses's eyes weren't on the vehicle. They were locked on the creature, sitting perfectly still beside the open door. Rex was older now, the years of aggression and isolation having left their own scars, but as Moses approached, the dog's ears snapped forward, and a soft, low whimper escaped his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated recognition. Moses dropped to his knees, the gravel biting into his aged skin, and buried his face in the thick, coarse fur of the German shepherd's neck. He wept then, not with the quiet, stoic tears of the roe, but with the racking, heaving sobs of a man who was finally, truly, home. He whispered the name only they knew, a secret kept through the decades of silence, and felt the warm, steady heartbeat of the only partner who had ever truly known his soul. As they drove away from the looming shadow of the towers, Moses looked out the window at the world that had moved on without him. He saw playgrounds filled with children whose parents hadn't even been born when he was first shackled, and he felt the hollow, aching gap of all the milestones he would never reclaim, the graduations he missed, the weddings he wasn't there to toast, and the quiet Sunday mornings that had been replaced by the clanging of bars. He was free, but he was a ghost in a new world, a man who had won his life back only to realize that the life he was supposed to have lived was now a collection of empty chairs and faded photographs. Rex rested his heavy head on Moses's knee, a silent sentinel for the man who had survived a system designed to bury its secrets by burying him. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but as the prison vanished in the rearview mirror, Moses felt a flicker of the master handler he used to be. He wasn't just walking away from a cage. He was stepping into a sunset that, for 30 years, had been nothing more than a memory. He had his witness, he had his freedom, and he had the one soul that had never doubted his light. But as he watched the miles grow between him and the gallows, he couldn't shake the cold, biting truth that while the bars were gone, the 30 years of stolen time would always be the heavy shadow he carried into the light. Sometimes the most beautiful endings are the ones that hurt the most, because they remind us of everything we were forced to leave behind. If you can still feel the weight of Moses's 30-year wait in your own heart, then you know this story deserved a witness. Thousands of people walk past stories like this every day without a second thought, but you stayed. Don't let his struggle be forgotten in the noise of the world. Subscribe now, and help us ensure that the voices they try to bury are finally heard.